Appeasement is one of the most famous terms from the Second World War period. Most people's knowledge of the time doesn't extend past D-Day, Pearl Harbor, Stalingrad, or perhaps the Battle of Britain, but for some reason, the term appeasement has also stuck in the public lexicon. Whenever the word is mentioned, it is absolutely always negative. The man most associated with the term, Neville Chamberlain, has gone down in history in an extremely negative light too. But is this justified? Was Neville Chamberlain really some kind of naive idiot? Was appeasement really such a bad policy? What even is appeasement? Firstly, the context. In 1933, Adolf Hitler came to power. Prior to this, he had always said that he wanted an amendment to Versailles. Millions of Germans had been left outside of the Reich's borders, which completely went against Woodrow Wilson's principle of self-determination. As a result, naturally, when Hitler had solidified his rule, he set about righting what he saw as the wrongs of Versailles. To make a long story short, there was almost 100,000 Germans living in the Memel region of Lithuania, there was over 3 million Germans in the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, and then there was another million in Poland. And then, finally, there was the unique case of Austria, which was in itself a German state, but one whose people wished to unite with Germany. The ethnic German issue alone is what caused the tension in Europe that led to the Second World War. This is where appeasement comes in. The majority of Europeans felt Germany's demands rather understandable. The Sudetenland was almost entirely German. The city of Danzig, even more so. Why shouldn't these areas be peacefully restored to Germany? It certainly wasn't a cause many people fancied dying for. The Austrian issue was the first to raise its head in February 1938. A month later, the Germans simply walked into the country where they were greeted with kisses and flowers. Hitler was so moved by this welcome that he decided to annex them on the spot, instead of installing a friendly government. This move emboldened Hitler to hold his nerve in future crises when it came to bringing his people home. Next, there was Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was a strange state in which there was actually more Germans than Slovakians. The Czechs themselves didn't even make up a majority of the population, and ever since the Sudeten Germans were annexed in 1919, it had been a troubled relationship. Hundreds, maybe even thousands of Germans had died during protests against Czech rule when they were put down in brutal fashion, and the Czechs systematically discriminated against the Germans at every opportunity. In 1938, President Beneš deliberately started a false crisis and mobilized his army, claiming it was in self-defense. Newspapers all over the world wrote stories about how little democratic Czechoslovakia had scared Germany back into her cage, and Hitler was made to publicly proclaim that he was not going to invade. Hitler wasn't done, however, and he was determined to see this crisis through. This is where the term appeasement is most known. After a lengthy crisis, Neville Chamberlain chose to intervene, and he had a bright idea. Rather than causing a war over a border region full of Germans wanting to return to Germany, why not simply arrange with Adolf Hitler himself to have the area peacefully return to the Reich? Hitler, of course, was happy to hear this, despite his wish to crush Czechoslovakia as an act of revenge for all they had put the Sudeten Germans through. History has recorded Chamberlain's idea here as backing down to superior force and just giving Hitler what he wanted, whatever the cost. But who wrote this history, which is now so accepted? Above all others, the answer is Winston Churchill. But is he so squeaky clean? Were his motives so noble? The truth is that Chamberlain was doing the right thing, not Churchill. In 1938, Winston Churchill's relationship with a shadowy group named The Focus, located in the City of London, came to the forefront. This group was entirely dedicated to bringing about a war with Hitler. They detested Hitler on a personal level and would go to any means to take him down. Churchill was quickly given millions of pounds so that he could rescue himself from bankruptcy. His end of the deal was that he had to agitate and bring about a war, which he duly did. He set about his task with delight, and during the 1938 crisis, he tried to turn everyone against Chamberlain at every turn. When Chamberlain returned home after his final meeting with Hitler, Churchill said, quote, "All is over. Silent, mournful, abandoned, broken Czechoslovakia recedes into darkness. We have passed an awful milestone in our history, when the whole equilibrium of Europe has been deranged, and the terrible words have for the time being been pronounced against the Western democracies. Thou art weighed in the balance and found wanting." End quote. But is this really an even remotely logical way of viewing events? The Sudetenland was a territory with an absolutely overwhelming German majority of over 90%. It has historically been German land, and Czechoslovakia had no claim to it, except for that it was defensible. Such a claim is silly, as the same argument can be made by the Germans, in even stronger terms, as their people actually lived there. In what way is allowing Germans the right to self-determination plunging Czechoslovakia into darkness? In what way is that an awful milestone in history? The simple answer is that Churchill was talking nonsense, and at the time, this was how the vast majority of the public, and indeed those in Parliament, felt. They felt, am I right in thinking, that Chamberlain's policy was nothing but righting a historical wrong? On what planet was this a cause worth sending a generation of young Brits to die for? Churchill impotently raged against Hitler after the crisis. The truth is, he had no logical leg to stand on. Appeaser is simply a buzzword, much like fascist or racist is today. There is simply no logical meaning behind the words, but they're effective nonetheless. Framing Chamberlain and anyone supporting his policy as weak and as if they are cowards backing down to superior force is an easy way to turn people against such a policy. Instead of the noble, righteous task that it was, the people were slowly turned over to Churchill's way of thinking. He framed it not as Germans rejoining with Germany, but as Hitler's grand plan for evil world domination. All the while, the British Empire ruled over hundreds of millions of foreign subjects. The comparison is almost comical to think about. Churchill was driving his nation towards war over Germans wanting to return home who lived in lands that foreign nations had no real claim to other than the Treaty of Versailles, a treaty which almost everyone by now viewed as unjust. Luckily for the world, Chamberlain was steadfast and stuck to his policy in Munich. A year later, however, the world would not be so lucky. Fake war scares, which would curiously appear out of nowhere, completely spiked the tension and made it seem as if Churchill, the raving old lunatic as many thought, was right. The most striking example was the Romanian war scare in March 1939. The Romanian ambassador warned of an impending German invasion, and he begged the British for help. For reference, Romania didn't even border Germany, and the reality was that there was never any German plans to invade Romania. Regardless, this scare whipped up a frenzy in London, and it massively contributed to the U-turn in British policy. Chamberlain was completely discredited, and at this point he was dying of cancer, making it very easy for Churchill and the other paid warmongers to walk all over him. Almost immediately, guarantees of independence began to be dished out like candy to random states around Europe. Even little Liberia asked for a guarantee in Africa. It appeared that everyone had gone mad. As a result of this, and intense agitation from those on payroll, like Churchill, Eden, and Duff Cooper, and others in other nations, Neville Chamberlain would not stick to his policy during the Danzig crisis, a city which was nearly 100% German. Adolf Hitler made extremely soft demands. He asked for the return of Danzig, not even the entire Polish corridor, but just the city, as well as a small, thin strip of land for a road to connect Germany proper to Prussia, through an area which too had a massive German population. At one point, he even suggested that the Poles could have de jure control, and that Germans could have de facto control, in order to save Polish prestige. This is the cause that the world went to war over. Britain issued a guarantee of independence, and as a result, the Poles refused to negotiate. They became extremely arrogant, and publicly mocked the Germans. Eventually, after such anti-German sentiment had been whipped up by the newspapers and the government itself, ethnic Germans began to be massacred by the thousands, and war became unavoidable. The Poles would not negotiate at all, and Hitler felt he had to save his people. The dying Chamberlain, allowing himself to be walked all over, and not sticking to his policy, had led the world into the deadliest war in history. Would telling the Poles that they couldn't count on British support unless they handed over Danzig, as well as perhaps stopping the atrocities against ethnic Germans, have been so bad? Would such a move really be plunging the world into darkness, or would it just simply be common sense? Is Poland, keeping an almost 100% German town, worth the war? The Brits certainly didn't think so a few years later, when Churchill told the Polish government to take a hike and gave the lands to Stalin. He didn't see a war with Stalin as worthwhile, nor did he care. His only loyalty was to his paymasters. His paymasters weren't paying him to agitate and go to war with Stalin. They were paying him to agitate and go to war with Hitler. Poland was simply the pretext. So in hindsight, was appeasement not the more logical policy? Hitler had no claims on the British Empire or France, so in general, the Brits shouldn't have been meddling in Eastern European affairs. Eastern Europe is essentially an endless fount of border wars and ethnic cleansing. One takeaway from the First World War should have been to not meddle in their affairs and just keep a hands-off approach, yet the Brits insisted on doing so. If they had to, their approach could simply have just been one of here. You can have the German areas, but no further. Unfortunately, Neville Chamberlain couldn't hold on to this policy any longer, and it appears that he himself didn't even want the war, as when it did finally break out, both sides didn't attack each other until Churchill started the Norway fiasco. All in all, it's time for a rethink over the word appeasement. Very few people today would say that we need to join Ukraine in their defence against Russia, which is actually a rather comparable situation given the border tension over the Russian-speaking population. These same people will say that we needed to fight Hitler over Danzig, a German city. There is no logical basis in fact, only coping to cover for past mistakes. The reality is that Chamberlain was right and Churchill was wrong. Sadly, for the millions that died due to such a policy, Chamberlain's position became untenable through no fault of his own. Thank you very much for watching. What do you think? Do you agree? Let me know in the comments. If you did enjoy, then please do leave a like, and most of all, share the video. It helps immensely. As always though, the biggest thank you of all goes to my Patreon, Subscribestar and YouTube members. These videos aren't monetized from the get-go when they receive most of their views. Instead, I need to wait for a manual review, and as a result, the vast majority of my income comes from these subscription sites. Without them, I wouldn't be able to do this as a full-time job, and I can't thank everyone who chooses to subscribe to them enough. If you do enjoy the videos, want to join our Discord, our weekly Hearts of Iron 4 games, or our Minecraft server, then please do consider signing up in the links in the description. Even the $2 tier helps more than you can possibly imagine. Thank you. Thank you to Lobster to You, Darway Lololol, Sigmar, Emperor Titus, Luke David Murphy, Chechen Natsok, Anton Berglund, Levi E, Friendly Brian, Mr. Malabar, Bushak, Firefly Enterprise, Henry Unruh, Evan Brightfield, Chef Jeff, Ethan Winstanley, Wunderwaffe, Mr. Bloom, Gav D, Gaiz Longanese Hanno, JD, Green Rebel, Angus Roxburgh, Rocksaka Too Heavy, Alexios Podcast Watcher, Citadel, Haste, Bojan M, Rick Me, Mr. Gaming, Cameron, Sludwig 1919, Gloomy, Troy Harser, Jagged Kampf, Rowan, Swedish Chef, Honda, Mirko, David Byers, Max Anton, Gragas, Conqueror, It's Okay to Be a Nationalist, Inflection Point, Vet Exempt, Automat 762X39, Monsoir Mercier, The Waller, Suma Klubayek, Jorgen 1997, and Admiral Kempinski.